What's up, everyone? Welcome back. I'm Jenny Grimsley, a coach, former fitness executive, and the person in your corner if you're a high performing professional who used to be a serious athlete and you want to train like it again. This is for people who know how to compete. You've done it your whole life. You need a framework that works with your schedule, your body, and the version of you that exists right now, not the one from 20 years ago. Today is going to be a direct follow-up from last week's newsletter. So if you haven't read it, go ahead and do that after you take a listen to this. And even if you haven't, don't worry about it. This episode is going to give you enough on its own. Now, if you haven't, go ahead and like and subscribe this so you can get updated when new videos drop and when my newsletter drops. So today, we're going to do a deep dive on the 3-step plan that helped me drop 5% body fat, add 2 pounds of muscle, and eventually swing a monstrous 220-pound kettlebell. And I'm talking deep, right? So the newsletter gave you the what. Like, what did I do to get to that? Now we're going to go deeper into the why and the how. Okay? So I want to start with something that might be a little bit uncomfortable. Most of you are not out of shape because you don't know what to do. You know what to do. You've known for years, and it's out there in the world, right? You need to eat better, train consistently, sleep a little bit more, manage your stress, right? You've read the articles, you've probably watched a bunch of YouTube videos, and maybe as a busy professional, you've coached other people through some version of transformation. Maybe not physical because you're in the business world, but you get it, right? And yet here you are, right? So your problem isn't not knowing what to do. It's not knowledge. The problem is that no one ever handed you a plan that was actually built for your life post-sports, right? So this plan is something that accounts for the fact that you are probably running a team. You're definitely managing a calendar that has very little margin for fluff, and you're carrying a certain level of stress that most people wouldn't last a week under. Now, the difference between you and your coworker is that you actually have a competitive background and they were in a sorority or a fraternity. Not the worst thing, but definitely not the same situation that you came up through. And a lot of times the generic fitness advice that you see out in the world was written for people with a ton of free time, a fair amount of flexibility, and no real consequences if they skip a session. But at the end of the day, that's not you. I don't think it ever was. And you don't need more motivation. You don't need another fitness influencer telling you to wake up at 5 a.m. and start your grind. What you need is a plan that actually is designed for how you live and the discipline that you already have as an ex-athlete to go ahead and execute that plan. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is the 3 steps that are built for people just like you. You played a busy sport and you transitioned into a successful career. And we're going to get into the specifics. And here's the thing, you don't have time for fluff, and neither do I. So we're going to go ahead and skip that step also. All right, so for those of you who didn't read last week's newsletter, let me give you a quick rundown of what we talked about. So a few years ago, I was working as an executive at a major fitness company. We ran tons of gyms across the country, right? I was the national director of fitness. And as a director, the CEO, held us to a certain expectation. And one day, he looked around his leadership team and noticed that something wasn't right. Like the people working the hardest were getting sick the most. They were burning the candle at both ends, and their bodies were actually the things paying the bill, not, their work or anything else. They were grinding but not taking care of their bodies. And so, as any good leader would, he created a challenge with some stakes. And anyone who was in a director role or above, who set an in-body-based goal, because that was our big metric of measurement at the time, and they hit that goal by the year end, they got a significant cash bonus, like in addition to their normal annual bonus. So we're like, all right, this is pretty damn cool. So everyone who was a director above set their goal, they wrote it down, like you should write down any goal, and they turned it in. Now, there had to be a receipt. You had to do a pre-InBody and you had to do a post-InBody. And it didn't matter how you got to the goal as long as you used the products of the gym, aka you show up and use the gym and then you don't eat like an asshole. Like those were really the only two constraints. You could do yoga, you could do HIIT classes, you could do group fitness, you could work with a personal trainer. It didn't really matter how you did it. And let me be clear, like this wasn't a vanity play. This wasn't just, hey, set a goal of fat loss. No, it was a set a goal that makes you healthier. There's nothing vain about it, right? We were running a fitness company and being healthy wasn't a perk of the job. It was the job. So if we were to be the ones to tell other people to use the gym, we better walk that walk before we have any business talking the talk. So that was a challenge, right? And if you're like me and you're somewhat competitive, you don't just take on challenges, you engineer ways to win. And so I wasn't competing against anyone else. I was competing against myself and the ability to take home some extra Christmas cash, right? Just like Kanye says, some of that extra Christmas dough. All right. So for me, I set a goal of improving my body fat by about 5 percentage points. Now, that is a lot considering on the InBody, I usually fluctuated between like 14 and 17%. Well, lucky for me, I was up at the, closer to 17% mark at the time. And so dropping down to, 12, 13% shouldn't have been that bad. So we started the 1st of October and we had the whole quarter to do this, right? So by the end of that quarter, I hit the goal of 5% body fat. I actually added a few pounds of muscle, and the scale itself actually didn't change, right? And so I hit that goal. I got the cash, right? And then funny enough, a few months later, I went to this event called Belfast and saw a 220-pound kettlebell. I was like, oh, I can swing that. Let me do it. There were a couple of guys that had attempted and failed, and I'm like, well, I think I can handle a kettlebell a little bit better than them, considering it's a big staple in my usual training. And I hiked that thing back and let it fly. And I put the video in the article, so you want to go back and look at that. It's also on my Instagram if you want to take a look at that. So that's the story, right? I set a goal, I did some work, made it happen, hit the goal, and then that goal carried me into the next accomplishment, right? So the newsletter hits the highlights of it, but I want to tell you and share with you kind of how I got it done, right? How I worked the plan, not only just setting the plan, because having a plan is important, but then working the plan and how we can apply a similar framework to you guys, right? So the 3 steps that I applied, or really not steps, but just kind of guidelines here, was 1, focusing on nutrition. And within that nutrition, focusing on my carb timing, because that's important, especially if you're trying to cut, but also maintain a decent level of strength. And then, of course, a focus on the training, because those things actually matter more than certain others, right? So first thing I want to talk about is building the baseline for our nutrition, right? So the first thing is, all right, fine, we're going to talk about diet. Everybody knows you can lose weight on a diet. The big eye roll, go ahead and have it, right? But stay with me just for a second. Because the thing was, it's not just about cutting carbs or go keto or let's start this thing off with a cleanse. Like none of that actually applies here. But the first thing I did was nothing. Nothing outside of normal. That's right, nothing outside of normal. For the first 3 weeks, I calculated my maintenance calories, meaning put it into a macro calculator with height, weight, sex, activity level, and the goal here was to eat at my maintenance calories. Now, the idea behind maintenance calories is it's a certain amount of food, right, that you eat and it helps you maintain your body weight. Okay? I didn't start out with a cut. What I started out with was making sure that I built my baseline first. I didn't cut anything. I didn't restrict anything. I just wanted to figure out what my body needed to maintain my current weight. And I ate at that consistently for 3 weeks. And a lot of times, this is where people blow their goals, right out of the gate. They start a plan, they immediately cut calories, 300, 500, sometimes more, right? You're getting down into the 12, 13, 1400 calories per day, and no one can survive on that for 12 weeks. So, yeah, the first couple weeks, the scale might move, but then it's going to stall out, right? You'll get frustrated. I've seen this over and over with my clients, right? Then you're like, you know what? Fuck it. I'm going back to eating normal. And guess what? The weight comes back. Shocker. So not only did you short-term lose some weight, but you probably had an even bigger rebound. And then the story goes, oh, well, I obviously can't do this. My metabolism is broken. It's more about discipline. Yeah, it's not a discipline problem. You did it for as long as your body could sustain it. You actually have a setup problem, right? So think of it this way. You can't cut calories from a foundation if you haven't built the foundation, right? If you know what your maintenance calories look like, meaning you've set a baseline, then you're just guessing, right? And guessing doesn't produce repeatable results. It actually just produces confusion. So if you know where you're starting from and how your body reacts to it, then you actually have something to cut from. Oh, and by the way, I ate at maintenance for 3 weeks because I wanted to make sure that I was actually eating at maintenance, not guessing if I was eating at maintenance, right? So this gave me the opportunity for everything, my metabolism to stabilize, to give me the actual data that I needed, right? The behavioral data. What am I eating? When am I eating it? Right? That information is super helpful when you start to go make changes. And then it actually makes the cut smaller and more sustainable, because if you've been eating at maintenance and then you pull back 100 calories, that's actually not that big of a cut, right? But if you are eating kind of all over the place and you're like, you know what, I'm pulling back by 500 calories, and you're like, holy crap, I am starving. So when we start at a little bit higher level, we have a lot more to cut back from. And if we stay at that higher level for just a little bit longer, right? Because I could have eaten at maintenance for a week, but I really wanted to make sure that I had something to cut from, even if it put me into a little bit of a surplus. Not the worst thing in the world, okay? Now, I've done that before, right? Where I've skipped setting my baseline. And similar to the results my clients get, I was able to lose some weight, but it wasn't what it needed to be. So back when I was doing CrossFit, I was like, you know what? I'm going to get abs for summer, starting in like March. I'm like, all right, summer's almost here. I probably should start this now. And knowing good and well, I wasn't eating enough to begin with, trying to cut from that, I ended up just like feeling more burnt out than ripped and shredded. And as soon as I started eating a little bit more, I actually was able to put on a little bit more weight. My abs looked much more defined. So rather than just being skinny, the goal eventually became to look defined. Okay, so for this one though, this is where I learned from that mistake. And after those 3 weeks, I started pulling back 100 calories at a time. Not a ton. And 100 calories for me was about, it was 2,500 total calories. That dropped me down to 24. So it ended up being just a few percentage points decrease. Now, if you're doing this, think of it this way. You don't want to drop more than 5, maybe 7% per week based on your baseline calories, right? So for me, it was 100 calories just because it was a nice even number that I could keep track of as I dropped, right? So at the end of the day, that's about the size of a tablespoon of peanut butter, right? Or, a little drizzle of olive oil. Is really not that much, but it compounds because remember, I was doing this for 12 weeks. And the more important thing is the smaller the step, the less you feel it, which means you can actually do it for a little bit longer period of time. Now, if I was only doing a cut for 4 weeks, then it would have been much more aggressive with a few refeed days, but I had 12 weeks, so why rush it? when I can actually do it in a way that will carry me through into whatever my next goal is, right? And I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is an idea that runs counter to everything that marketing and the diet culture and Instagram and YouTube tell you, right? You've got to go do the hard thing, make these dramatic cuts. You'll see these awesome before and after photos. But what happens after the after photo, right? So the idea here is small, consistent adjustments. That's what actually makes the body composition changes that last, okay? So dramatic cuts, I'll tell you this, make for awesome before and after photos. Small, consistent adjustments actually make for results that last. And the fitness industry wants to sell you on the before and after photos because it's exciting, right? You can see someone actually drop weight, but a lot of times it's not fat that they lose, it's a decent amount of water. They just dry themselves out. But I want you to focus on the latter because it's the thing that actually works, okay? So within the nutrition, because we're going to be in a slight calorie deficit, I wanted to be a little bit smarter with fueling my workout. So a lot of times the calorie deficit came from carbohydrates, which, keep in mind, carbohydrates are the thing that allows you to work at a high intensity during your workout. Okay, so this is where I started to get really specific. And I see a lot of folks who are just cutting calories blindly leave a fair amount of results on the table. And that thing is carb timing. Now, if you've spent any time watching the fitness culture from afar on Instagram, you've probably been told carbs are the enemy. They're bad for you. They drive insulin spikes. They, lead to type 2 diabetes, a lot of those things. And some of that is true. But on the other hand, some of the diets that have been pushed, like keto, say that, low carb is the answer. But also at the same time, you miss out on fiber. You miss out on other vitamins and minerals that you can't get from a keto or a carnivore type diet. So think of it this way. Balance is probably the best approach, right? And listen, I'm not here to bash people's religion with nutrition because it can get pretty deep and cult-like. But we want to find an approach that actually works for someone, not just a short-term fix. Okay, so for an athlete, we would tell them they need to eat carbs. Like, think about when you traveled. We always ate at Olive Garden the night before and Golden Corral on game day. Because what could we get? Lots of food, lots of calories in a short period of time. And that works. So we're going to take that concept and apply it to real life because you're going to be training with intensity, right? I was training pretty damn hard, lifting real weights, and I was trying to maintain muscle while cutting fat. And so cutting carbs around your workout is probably the worst thing you can do because your muscle runs on glycogen. And glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrates in the muscle. So when you train without eating carbs around your workout, you're essentially trying to run this workout on an empty tank, right? So you want your glycogen to be fully stocked, meaning you're going to eat some carbs throughout the day, but most of your carbs are going to come around your workout because then it's in your bloodstream. It can be easily pulled into the muscle for energy, and then you can make sure that your performance doesn't suffer. You can make sure your recovery doesn't suffer. And if you do both of those things, more than likely, you're going to maintain your muscle mass, okay? And that's the name of the game here because muscle doesn't just look good. It actually helps you metabolically. So when you think about your metabolism, muscle is your metabolism, right? The more you have of it, the more calories you can burn at rest. You become much more insulin sensitive, and the better your body handles basically everything. You're more mobile, you can be more active. But if you're cutting carbs and losing muscle in the process, you're trading your long-term metabolic health for short-term scale improvement. And that's not the best deal you could possibly have, right? That's part of the reason why GLP-1s, people lose a fair amount of weight, but as a part of that fair amount of weight, you also lose muscle. So the strategy here is simple. Put the carbs when they do the most work, right? Before your workout, those fuel the session. And after your workout, those help drive recovery and assist with some muscle protein synthesis, aka muscle building, right? The rest of your meals can focus on proteins and fats, right? We want to create a little bit of metabolic flexibility to use carbs when we're working really hard, but when we're not working hard, be able to burn through fat that you take in from your diet, not necessarily what you have stored on your body. That's a slightly different system, but be able to utilize fat as the fuel rather than carbs throughout the day. That'll help with insulin sensitivity over time as well, which is a big health concern as we get older, right? So this shouldn't be complicated, right? This isn't some special protocol. I haven't trademarked it. It's just matching how you fuel to your activities of the day, right? It's kind of like your race car, right? You fill up at the pit stop, not only before you work out and not after, right? You have these periods of high intensity racing and you got to kind of refuel during the race. If not, you're going to end up running out of gas and not finishing the race, okay? And so I mentioned metabolic flexibility, and this just makes it a little bit easier for you. And it also helps to reset your palate. Okay, so a lot of my clients have dealt with changing their diets, and they're like, "Oh man, like this is much harder than I thought it was going to be." And just a quick story about my parents. My parents have the biggest sweet tooth I think I've ever seen in the entire world. Like anything that comes from a box that is a cookie or a treat or an ice cream, they freaking love it. And they came to visit one time, and we keep fruit cut up in the fridge, right? So we have our eggs and usually cut fruit as our breakfast. Like that is what it is. When they came down the first time, we served them up scrambled eggs and a little bit of fruit, and they asked for sugar to go on the fruit. I'm like, what the hell? Like, well, it's not sweet enough. I'm like, oh, damn. All right. Well, so we had the conversation, and coaching your parents is never the easiest thing to do because they know more than you do, even though this has become your career. I'm sure anyone who's an accountant or an attorney and their parents are pretty well educated as well, then you end up having these types of conversations. But it took us a couple weeks and a couple trips of them coming down, hanging, and having these conversations, and they eventually got to a point where they keep fruit in their fridge now without the sugar, but it took a little bit of palate retraining to get away from it. And the nice thing about pairing your carb strategy with slight decreases in calories helps with cravings. It also helps with palate resets, and it still gives you the ability to eat sweets just during a certain period of time. So it usually happens around your workout. And if you've seen me post anything about gummy bears or Sour Patch Kids or anything like that, that's because I eat them mostly around my most active time of the day, which would be my workout, right? And so it's one of those things where a lot of us have a complicated relationship with food, okay? Not in a clinical sense. It's just there's so many different nutrition camps out in the world, and it all is contradictory, right? There's tons of sources, things come in, information changes, right? And for the most part, people tend to go on autopilot because that's the simplest path forward. They eat what's convenient, they eat what's right in front of them, and sometimes, and I've had this happen to me before too, of you get busy working on a project during the day and holy shit, it's 5 hours later and you skipped lunch. And then you go and find something that's just quick and easy that should hold you over to dinner, even though it may not be the best option. And remember, guys, this is not an attack on your character. It's just you have shit to do. And without a clear framework, it makes it really hard. So, as the second piece of this framework is eat your sweet stuff around your training. And if you're not training, pull back a little bit. It's as simple as that. You don't need to have as much on either days that you're not training or times of the day after your workout. Okay. You can build a really effective nutrition approach on this single approach alone. All right. The final piece, strength, which is probably where a lot of people start. Okay. And for me, that's pretty standard. I train 5 to 6 days a week, right? It's one of those things that I work in the industry. I should also practice what I preach, right? So for me, it's 5 to 6 days per week. But for most folks, 3 days a week is enough. 45 minutes in and out, hit the big lifts, get it in, get done. You can still look pretty damn good with 3 45-minute full body workouts per week. Hit your 10,000 steps and you're good. But for this, I'm going to talk about how I set up my training so that every day didn't destroy me. It actually added, drops into the bucket. It allowed me to train a little bit harder for a little bit longer, right? And I think for many of us who played sports, you go into preseason camp and you're like, all right, I can survive 2 weeks of high intensity. And if I can do that, I can survive anything else. And you guys probably experienced that as well. And, the impulse to go and try to push as hard as you can just comes from us being pushed to our limit for years in practice, in games, in preseason camps, in leading up to the season, like all of these things, right? We used to be told that pain is a part of the process, right? Exhaustion means that you've committed fully to that process. But that mindset can cost you a little bit when you're also layering in a caloric deficit, right? So when you're in a deficit, high volume training isn't discipline. You're actually just burning yourself out. You're trying to signal your body so that your muscle is worth keeping, not burning through because it's a highly metabolic tissue, right? So you don't want your recovery capacity to be cannibalized because you're working at too high of intensity. Training in a deficit is not the same as training to build muscle, right? This is where you have a surgical approach. We need precision, intentionality, and efficiency. Just enough to stimulate the muscle, and that's it. Because you're going to be in a cut, you're not going to have those extra calories to get you over the hump, okay? So here's what I did when I was setting up my training for this particular goal, okay? My rep ranges stayed on the lower end, meaning my big lift of the day was in the 3 to 6 rep range using compound movements. So think squat, think deadlift, bench press, pull up. Those were the 4 exercises that typically led off every single session, one per session. Okay, meaning I wanted the weight to be challenging and more of a tax on my central nervous system than on my musculoskeletal system. And let me give you a quick physiology thing. The more volume you do, the more of a stress on the tissues it is. The more intensity you do, meaning less volume, it's more of a signaling thing from the brain and spinal cord to the muscle to contract at a high rate of force and a high speed, right? So I wanted to keep the volume moderate, meaning I wasn't doing 15 sets per muscle group. I was doing just enough to get that signal to go from brain to muscle and then cutting it short, okay? Some of my accessory work, like core or, arms or shoulders, yeah, that got a little bit higher, but the big stuff stayed in that lower rep range, okay? Because I wasn't trying to burn myself out. I was just trying to maintain the mass that I had spent months building at this point. And this is part of what I mean when I say strength is a skill, okay? A skill session looks a little bit different from a conditioning session, right? So go back and think about speed work. Now, if you had a really good strength coach, you probably will know the difference. Speed can't be developed when you're tired. Conditioning can't be developed when you're working on speed, okay? The way that we have to look at it is separate, okay? You're doing enough at a high intensity and then giving ample time to recover. Okay? When you worked on speed and you walked out of the gym, you probably didn't feel destroyed. You probably actually felt pretty capable and just, ready to do whatever you have next. That means you did quality work. That means you got some good movement in and you challenged yourself, but you didn't leave everything out on the field so that you couldn't go in and do, whatever you had next in your day. You weren't just smoked by the end of it. And as an adult, this is where consistency comes into play. And with that consistency comes your results, right? So after 12 weeks, of hitting higher intent movements with lower volume, my scale weight actually didn't move. Now I knew I was losing fat, but I kept every couple weeks you do a check-in weigh and you're like, yeah, I dropped a little bit on my overall weight, but that muscle number keeps creeping up, right? So by the end of it, I lost 3 pounds of fat and gained 2 pounds of muscle. So I was -1 by the time it was all said and done, right? So when I got on the InBody, that's the thing. And again, InBody may not be the most perfect way of measuring, but it gives you nice trends over time. And the scale didn't change. But then as soon as I showed up to do Belfast, walking up to a 220-pound kettlebell just on pure instinct and then moving it, it's not because I trained the kettlebell swing specifically. It's because I had built a level of strength, even in a caloric deficit, that was ready for anything. Okay? So now that you've got these 3 things, let me bring it all back together, right? 3 approaches: build your baseline, fuel your work, and train with precision, right? These things aren't complicated. They're pretty damn simple. And none of them actually require you going out and overhauling your entire life, hiring a dietitian, right? Or spending 3 hours in the gym. They only require that you put a plan in place and then have the discipline to follow it. And it may not be the perfect plan, but as long as you have a plan and you are disciplined to it, you're probably going to see results, right? And that's, something that I need to continue to learn, and you probably also need to learn as well. You already have discipline. You had it since you started showing up at 5 a.m. for your weights back in the day, right? The athlete inside of you doesn't disappear when you take your jersey off, right? It might go underground for a little bit because you've got bigger priorities. And one of the greatest things that I get to do in my work is help people just like you reconnect with that part of themselves. That part that knows how to commit to a process. They know to trust the plan and show up even when it's inconvenient, right? That version of you is still there. We're just giving it somewhere to go, right? And this is what I want you to do this week, okay? Pick one of these 3 steps, just one. You don't need all 3, but ask yourself honestly, right? Are you actually doing that? Are you actually being smart about what you're eating and you know what your macros are? Are you doing it sometimes, all the time, never? And if the answer is no, then that's your starting point, right? The idea that everything gets overhauled means nothing actually gets overhauled, right? You just need your next right step. That's it, okay? So if you've been listening to me ramble on for a while, right, you know what I do and who I do it for, right? I coach high-performing professionals that were once serious athletes. You played, high-level high school, college, maybe even some pros. I've got a couple of each in my client list right now. And you are people who already know what winning is like in your careers. And now you want your physical health to match that, okay? So if that's you, and if you're ready to stop winging it and start working with someone who has built and tested this system on themselves first, I'd love to talk, right? You can apply to work with me on my website. Take a look at it, see if it resonates, right? There's no pressure. I'm not going to pitch you, right? It really is just so that I understand where you're coming from, and then I can discover a little bit more information about you and figure out where I can help you and what your next steps would be. So again, Thanks for listening, and if this episode was useful, share it with someone who needs it. And go read the newsletter if you haven't already. I need the likes, right? I'll see you next time.